All right. So, two types of contracts we want to be familiar with. The first being a bilateral contract, which is thought of as a promise for a promise. All right. This means the offeree, which is the person who has been made the offer, accepts, and you have a contract at that point. The parties still have to perform. Still have to, if I've contracted to purchase 10 bushels of corn, and the farmer and I have agreed to a price, but the corn hasn't yet been delivered and I haven't yet paid for it. That's a bilateral contract. But we have an agreement at the time in which I have agreed to buy the 10 bushels of corn for $100. All right. Unilateral contract. There's only one promise in a unilateral contract. And the way to think about this, is unicycle, like one. Unicycle has one wheel. There's one promise in a unilateral contract. Bicycle has two wheels. There are two promises in a bilateral contract. So in a unilateral contract, let's say that I send a text message to my landscaper saying, will you cut my yard on Saturday? If you are able to do so, I will pay you $50. All right, so I send that in a text. Well, I've promised to pay $50 if the landscaper cuts my yard. The landscaper hasn't promised to do anything. How does the landscaper accept? Well, he shows up on Saturday and cuts the grass. All right. So that's the difference between a bilateral and a unilateral contract. Formal versus informal, I'm less concerned about. It's not heavily tested. But when we're talking about formal contracts, really we're talking about contracts that have to be in a specified format to be enforceable. Like one example is if I agree to co-sign, that has to be in writing to be enforceable. I can't orally agree to co-sign someone else's loan, right? Informal contracts are default, so if there is no statutorily prescribed format, then the contract is informal. Let me pause to say this, and we'll get back to it, I'm sure. But we often think of contracts as this document where both parties have signed at the end, and it can be that. But oral contracts are also enforceable. There's nothing that says that contracts have to be written to be enforceable. So oral contracts are enforceable. They may be difficult to enforce if the parties disagree on the terms, but there are some exceptions, but generally oral contracts are enforceable. Contracts can be express or implied. So express really just means that the parties have devoted some time and effort to determining what the terms of the contract are, and either reduced it to paper, reduced it to writing and signed it on paper, or agreed orally. Whereas implied contracts are based on the behavior of the parties. And it's easier to use examples to describe an implied contract. But if I walk into a store, all right, a retail establishment, make some selections, take them to the counter, to the register to pay for them. Well, that's an implied contract, right? I haven't really communicated with the clerk, but there's a price tag, and that is going to be the price, and so that's an implied contract. because it's based on the conduct of the parties. So let's look at the requirements, right? Plaintiff furnished some service or property. Plaintiff expected to be paid for that service or property, and the defendant knew or should have known that payment was expected, and the defendant had a chance to reject goods or services reject the services or property and did not. Okay, so as an example, if I'm sitting on my front porch and a landscaper shows up, starts cutting my grass, I see the landscaper. I'm not sure what's going on, but I don't speak. I don't say anything to stop. Maybe I'm sitting, maybe I'm having, a nice Corona or lemonade, pick your whatever. And when the landscaper is done, he presents me an invoice and expects to be paid. Well, my response at that point in time was, well, I didn't order any landscaping service. Well, as it turns out, the landscaper's at the wrong house, right? But there's an implied contract in that case because I watched and received the service. I didn't speak up or say anything, so I'm going to be obligated to pay for that service, right? Now, obviously, that's a bit different if I wasn't at home, right, and the landscaper cut my grass. I didn't have an opportunity to reject that service at that point, but that's how implied contracts work. When we say performance, in a bilateral contract, that is after the parties have agreed but not yet performed. So an executed contract means both parties have done what they promised they were going to do. An executory contract means that one or more party hasn't done what they said they were going to do, right? So in a bilateral contract, once the parties have agreed, it's executory until such time as both parties have done what they agreed to do. At that point, then it's executed. Okay, so let's spend a few moments talking about enforceable, voidable, unenforceable, and void. All right, so we kind of have this decision tree. We're dealing with a contract. A contract is either valid or void. A void contract is not even a contract at all. There is no contract. It's lacking one of the four elements that we previously discussed: agreement, consideration, capacity, and legality. All right, missing one of those four, no contract at all. If it has those four elements, it's a valid contract, and then we can proceed on to the next phase of our decision tree. Enforceable. That's what we want when we contract. That means if either party fails to perform, the courts will enforce that contract and hold the non-performing party liable, right? A valid contract can be enforced because there are no legal defenses to it. Avoidable contract. Party has the option of avoiding the contract. The best example here is when you contract with a minor, so somebody under the age of 18. You can have a valid contract, but the minor can choose not to live up to their contractual promise. This is why you can't get a credit card until you're 18, because that's a contract. And if you contracted with a minor, they could run up credit card charges and then just not pay the bill. An unenforceable contract is still valid, but courts will not enforce it. Right? And this could be because of the improper form So you put something that required a formal contract, think a few slides back, in an informal way. One example would be I agree to co-sign for someone orally. Well, statute requires that that be written. So that would be an unenforceable contract, even though it's valid.